Welcome to Munich Dialogues on Democracy. To all of you here in the theater, as well as to everyone who's joining us from around the world online. I'd like to welcome you from the team at amerikahaus, as well as from the Yale Club of Germany. That's the partnership that's behind this program. We're continuing our blockbuster programming for this mega election year. As I said last time, there are over 70 elections around the world this year. And tonight's topic is relevant in elections all around the world. Angry populist politics. Here in Germany, the far-right AfD and the new far-left are polling at almost 30% together. In France, Marine Le Pen on the far-right and Jean-Luc Mélenchon on the far-left poll at 28% and 24% respectively. That's 51% of the population. And isolationist MAGA Republicans in the US are wielding their power, holding up popular legislation on support for Ukraine, for Israel, and for measures at the southern border, immigration measures. Since 2016, there has been a dramatic erosion of support for establishment parties in favor of populist and even anti-system ones in so many different countries. Why is this happening, asks our guest tonight. And importantly, what can be done? Tonight, we are honored to welcome Ian Shapiro, Sterling Professor of Political Science at Yale University. He has written influentially on democracy, justice, and methods of social inquiry. A native of South Africa, he has his J.D. from the Yale Law School and his Ph.D. from the Political Science Department at Yale, where he has been teaching since 1984, and he served as chair from 1999 to 2004. He also headed the Macmillan Center for International Area Studies from 2004 to 2019. He's a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and the American Philosophical Society, and he's a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. I would like to mention his new book that comes out in April, Uncommon Sense. No one else in political science combines Shapiro's astonishing range of political knowledge and his gritty intensity of political purpose. It's called A Rich Source of Insight and Inspiration in Dark Political Times. We can all use that right now. I could go on and list the many, many award-winning books he has written and the lovely messages that I had from his former students around Germany. But I want to give you more time with him than with me. I will note, though, that his students really are in the room where it happens, whether it is the Oval Office, the Situation Room, or foreign policy presentations to NATO, or classrooms just outside of Berlin. Teachers. You have equipped your students very well, Professor Shapiro. After his talk, we are very lucky to have a special moderator tonight to join the conversation on stage. Dr. Dominik Tolksdorf is currently in Berlin, currently here, but you work in Berlin, at the German Council on Foreign Relations, where he's an expert on US domestic politics, foreign policy, and relations with Germany and the EU. Prior to that, he served for many years as the program director for foreign and security policy at the Heinrich Böll Stiftung in Washington, D.C., and he worked at several think tanks in the U.S. and in Europe. We will have time to take questions during the conversation part, and we will be using Slido as always. So if you're here in the theater, you can scan, it comes up the Slido, and just put hashtag amerikahaus with your questions. And if you are at home, you go to slido.com, use hashtag amerikahaus, and put in your questions. And we'll try to get to as many as we can with the time that we have together. So without further ado, please join me in giving Professor Ian Shapiro a warm Munich willkommen.
Thank you all. Thank you for coming out on a wintry night and for joining us in this conversation today. My title is self-explanatory as to what I'm going to talk about, and this will be the agenda. I'm going to say a little bit about what is populism. Then I will talk about what I think of as the main underlying causes of it. And they're basically economic. There are three I'm going to talk about: long-term job insecurity, then the weakening and fragmentation of political parties, that's the political dimension of this, Those two things have been going on over the last 20 years, even longer. But then there is the responses to the financial crisis of 2008 and their aftermath. Then I will talk about what is to be done. And I'm going to focus not on one country, on one political system, because what I have found is many people, in trying to understand these developments in their own country, tend to focus on specific features of their circumstances. You know, it's the two-party system, or it's some particular politician or personality, or you know, it's some specific thing about their circumstances. But clearly, this is going on in so many countries with very different political systems that there must be some common causes to understand. And so that's mostly what I'm going to be focused on. So let's get right to it. When people mean different things by populism, and I'm basically talking about these four things that are familiar enough to all of us: distrust of establishment elites, alienation from mainstream parties and governments, hostility to immigration, to foreigners, various forms of xenophobia, and also openness to protectionism and protecting domestic industries, and willingness to embrace charismatic figures promising simplistic one-size-fits-all remedies. And they seem to retain their popularity whether their remedies are even implemented, or if implemented, whether they work, which for the most part they don't. So I want to start off by talking about insecurity. And here, I think this is a very important picture. This is from the US, but it's a story you could tell in many of the most advanced democracies. And what it is, it's a panel, what the social scientists call a panel study. They've been following essentially baby boomers, people born since the late 1950s until 64, to see how many times they changed jobs in their working lifetimes. And the takeaway from this slide is that for people born in this era and since, they should expect to change jobs 12 to 15 times during their working lives. So the world in which people, you know, my age and older grew up, where you finished your education, whether high school or college, you got a job with an employer, you worked there for 30 years, then you retired. That world has gone away. Most people born today are going to have to retool many times and move into things that when they finish their high school or college education, they don't even know what they're going to have to be moving into when they're 40 years old. Now, for some people, that's just fine. Because if they're on the right side of the information revolution and they go to excellent universities, let's say, for them, that, you know, they may work in a few startups or work for McKinsey or something like that for a few years, start building up nest eggs, and then maybe go back to business school, and they'll go from opportunity to opportunity. But that's not the vast majority of the people. For the vast majority of people, they're basically going down the socioeconomic ladder. They're going from full-time jobs that have high status to less good jobs with less status to part-time jobs with very low status, and they don't see better prospects for their children. This is the first generation where, even in countries like the US, where there's been a lot of mobility and expectation for upward mobility, they don't see a better world for their children than they had, and their children don't see it. And so that is a sort of major underlying factor in what's going on. And if you look here, where is the number of years spent in a job decline the most? It's middle-aged men. This is the population of people who are having to adjust to the fact that long-term job security has gone away. And I think that when you think about the 2016 election in the US, you know, these two slogans, Hillary's slogan was America's best years lie ahead, and Donald Trump's was Make America Great Again. Actually, they were both cribbed from Ronald Reagan. But when Ronald Reagan said Americans' best years lie ahead in 1980, these processes were just getting going. But to say it in 2016, what it tends to signal to voters is you're out of touch with my world. When Trump says, make America great again, he's saying, you know, something's been taken away from you and I'm going to get it back. Whether it's your job that's gone to China, whether it's the communities that have disintegrated, I'm going to recreate the America of the past. And it's a backward-looking mantra that whether he stumbled on it by luck or by, you know, great research and so on, who knows? But I think it sums up the difference between connecting to the insecure world of these of this population and not connecting to it. So let me talk first about how this plays out in two-party systems like the US and the UK. And here, I think, you know, the big phenomenon that we have to understand is the weakening of political parties. And if you look at the US, so we have primary elections. I'm sure you've all heard. You're hearing about them on the news all the time right now. And of course, if most voters are in the middle, you would think most politicians would be heading for the middle because they want to get elected. But of course, they have to win their primaries first. And so that means you would think the Democrats would head for the median Democrat voter and the Republicans would head for the median Republican voter. But that's not even true because very few people turn out for these primaries, and they tend to be the activists on the fringes of the parties. So you think, well, so that's where they head. Well, actually, it's not even that. It's that. Because you get a lot of these primaries have, you know, 8, 9, 10, 11% turnout of the activists on the fringes of the parties. And so, like a little-known fact, in 2016, Donald Trump was picked as the Republican candidate by 6% of the US electorate. Very tiny number of voters turning out for these things. But then they pull the parties to, they pull them apart because you know, anyone who is vulnerable to a primary election has to satisfy the people going to turn out in the primaries. Now, you know, you could say, well, but primaries have been around in America for 120 years. We are just seeing this politics now. So what's changed? And what's changed is the number of competitive seats has consistently been falling for over a century. But particularly in this period we are talking about, the number of competitive seats has got smaller and smaller and smaller. And of course, in the non-competitive seats, the only election that matters is the primary. Once the primary is over, you know, Jim Jordan in the 4th District of Ohio, once the primary is over, he's going to be the congressman. Or, you know, AOC, the very left-wing phenomenon in the 12th District of New York, when she wins the primary, it's all over, right? And so what you have is this phenomenon that is worse on the Republican side because there are more Republican safe seats for reasons we could talk about in the question and answer if people want. And it's also true in the Senate that there are more safe Republican states in the Senate. So this means the right wing of the Republican Party is more powerful than the left wing of the Democratic Party, not for reasons of personality or strategy or messaging, but this underlying fact that there are fewer competitive elections in Republican seats. And so the primary voters rule the day. And it affects also presidential politics because anybody who angers Trump can get primaried in their own district. So even what's going on in the legislative also affects the executive. Think about Britain, just to take another two-party system. It used to be the case that the leaders of the parties were picked by the parliamentary parties. So the parliamentary Labour Party picked the leader of the Labour Party. The parliamentary Conservative Party picked the leader of the Conservative Party. And about 20 years ago, they said, no, we need more democracy. And so they went to systems where the party members have a much bigger role in picking the leader. And so you've got a situation, they're very like primary voters in the US. So Jeremy Corbyn, who's a far-left Marxist, wins the leadership of the Labour Party in 2015. He is way to the left of most Labour voters, never mind most British voters. And so once he gets to be the leader, all the parliamentary Labour Party find they can't support him because if they do, they're going to lose their seats in their districts. So they vote the next year by 172 to 40, no confidence in Jeremy Corbyn. And 3 months later, the membership re-elects him. This is the 450,000 members, the activists, re-elect him by 62%. So there's a party that can't be on the same page about what they're doing because they can't support him, but they're stuck with him. And so it's the same as the leadership in Congress in the US can't enact programs because the policies that the far extremes of their parties will vote for because they have to, otherwise they're going to get primaried, are not the policies that the ones in the competitive seats will vote for. And that's why you see so much gridlock. The Conservative Party, again, you have, I'm not going to go through them all unless people are interested, but leadership election after leadership election after leadership election. With the Conservative Party, the parliamentary party gets it down to 2, and then it goes to the membership. And the person that the parliamentary party wants is not the person that the members pick. And so you get an analogous situation to what I've just described in Labour. So let's talk about multi-party systems since we're in one tonight. And there the big story is fragmentation. And it's quite a puzzling story in some ways. And this is some research I'm doing with some postdocs. We've put together data from 26 OECD countries over the last 60 years. And what's remarkable here is that the number of parties in the parliament has gone up. So from effective parties just discounts them by size, but tells the same story. If you just look at the black line, you can see from fewer than 6 to more than 8 parties in the parliaments of all the OECD multi-member systems, multi-party democracies. And even more puzzling is that until about 2012, somewhere around there, this is now fragmentation of left of center parties, right? So in Germany, it would be the SPD, the Greens, the Linke, and so on. People have basically been voting for left-of-center parties, but they've been abandoning the traditional parties for other parties. So you might think, well, why is that? And it comes back to where I started this talk, which is that with the disappearance of industrial jobs, the traditional left-of-center mainstream parties, like the SPD here, they are very closely connected to the industrialized workers through the trade union movements, but that is a shrinking constituency. And so you've got lots of workers who are not in that sector. They're in the service sector, or they're long-term unemployed, or they've fallen out of the labor market completely. And those people don't feel protected by the party that's basically connected to the unionized workforce. And so what you get is that the traditional left-of-center parties are defending a shrinking constituency less well. It's shrinking because they're leaving that sectors of the economy, and they defend them less well because they have less leverage. And so the disaffected workers become available to be mobilized by populist parties. And so that just, if you plot the disappearance of industrial jobs on the same chart as the fragmentation of left parties, you can see they're like ships passing in the night. There's also fragmentation in the right, but it's less systematic. And I think a lot of it is a response to the fragmentation of left-of-center parties. And I talk about that afterwards if people want. But, you know, Germany is, it's interesting to talk about Germany because people who often say that, I mean, beyond that we're in Germany, people often say, you know, Germany has the most well-functioning multi-party system, or they used to say it. And, you know, they've just hit the sweet spot of got the mix between multi-member district, PR and single-member districts, and it's just exactly the right balance. But even in Germany, I could tell you the same story from many other countries. But, you know, we went from a world in which, in 1994, the two big parties accounted for almost 80% of the vote to the last election where they didn't even get half. It's the same thing on a picture for people who prefer pictures to numbers. But you can see there that purple line is the combination of CDU, CSU, and the Social Democrats finally falling below half in 2021. And so for the first time, it took three parties to form a government. Had never happened before. And you know, that wasn't a flash in the pan either. If you look here, you know, Bartley talked about the emergence of the AfD. This poll, I updated this polling last week. They have doubled their share of the vote from 10 to 20% of the vote since the election, and the SPD has just completely cratered to 2015. The AfD is easily the second biggest party now. And if they were excluded, it would take a grand coalition of the three next biggest parties. You couldn't have the kind of traffic light coalition you have right now. It wouldn't add up to 50%. It would have to be both the CDU, the SPD, and the Greens to form a government that excluded the AfD. And then, of course, as Bartley also mentioned, we have this new wild card of BSW. This is a left-wing populist. She used to be a De Linke rep politician, and she was polling at 14% in the fall. I found a poll from last month at 12%. I found a poll showing her polling at 14%, and it's not clear where all of her support is coming from. Seemed like 4% from the AfD, 3% from the CDU, but where's the rest of it coming from? It's not clear. So we won't know until how's that? Can you click the slide for me, maybe? Yeah, no matter what, whatever, the outcome is, the one thing we do know is we'll increase fragmentation in the German parliament. And that makes governing difficult and ineffective, and then that further alienates voters because they say these governments aren't able to do anything. And you think about the current government in Germany, as I said, the SPD has cratered. Now you might want to say, well, why? And there may be people in this room who know more about that than I do, but my impression is it's principally two things. One has been dealing with the war in Ukraine since 2022. But the other really speaks to the problem you get with these big coalitions of large numbers of parties, is that it's very difficult for them to have any kind of coherent policies about anything because the parties don't agree on what they should be doing. So here you have, for instance, the Greens have a green agenda, right? The Free Democrats have an anti-regulatory austerity agenda. And the SPD can be toppled by either of them if they're not happy. And so you get the situation that I'm sure you all know very well about these heat pumps, for example, where they're incredibly energy efficient. They're wonderful. I have them in my house in Vermont, and they save a lot of my energy bills. But there are these mandates to put them in, and they're not 100% subsidized because the SPD wouldn't be able to do that. The Free Democrats would never put up with that. And so it's seen as a source of real anger and resentment of the government that people are being obliged to put in these heat pumps. And so the SPD is sort of left wringing their hands in the middle, unable to govern, and just incurring more and more voter wrath. And so the more fragmentation you get, or the weaker the parties you get in two-party systems, the angrier voters become. And eventually along will come somebody and say, what's needed here is a strong hand. What's needed here is somebody who can, break through all the, squabbling politicians in the legislature who can't agree on anything and who can't do anything. And it's because we've put in so many political reforms that have essentially immobilized parties in the legislature and makes it impossible for them to govern. So the last point in my analysis is, as I said, I think that responses to the financial crisis have really triggered there's been the sort of final nail in the coffin, if you like, of a conventional political competition. Because until the financial crisis, the technical elites had so much legitimacy. Capitalism was the only game in town now. Everybody had to basically follow the standard neoliberal diet, the Washington Consensus, and they knew how to run the world. And all of that became came into question in 2008, when their prescriptions had produced the worst financial crisis since the Depression. And but what happened was they basically bailed out the banks while doing very little for the people in the real economy who were hurt hard. And this happened, you can compare Obama's response to the financial crisis with FDR's response to the Great Depression, and it was the exact opposite. FDR went after responding to the people in the real economy in a whole host of ways, whereas Obama basically bailed out the banks, and the 20 million plus people who lost their homes and whose downward mobility accelerated, who hadn't come back 3 years later when the stock market was back and the people at the top were fine. They were the people who were left out in the cold. Tooze tells us very much similar story in his book, Crashed, about Europe, about essentially the elite-centered response to the crisis. And these divergent outcomes start to become clear 3 or 4 years later when most people's economic fortunes have not come back, but the elites have. But no one's been held to account. And that's when these populist entrepreneurs see the opportunity, the sort of Trumps, the Farages, the AfD, the Marine Le Pen, and some mainstream politicians adapt. Boris Johnson, Orban, Erdogan, they retool as to take advantage of this. And that's what starts coming home to roost. So, what's got to happen? It's basically on the political front. It's policies to reduce the importance of primaries, to redistrict, to avoid so many safe seats, and then combating fragmentation with higher thresholds, more single-member districts, and so on. Those are the political reforms that are needed. In the economics, it's addressing the underlying insecurities that are driving people to be mobilizable by these populist entrepreneurs. And that means thinking about how people are going to survive in this world where they're going to have to keep changing jobs and are not going to be able to live and have a lifestyle of somebody who could reasonably expect to have 30 years of employment with one employer. And the gold standard for this, I think, is Denmark. And probably the country that does it worst is the US. But basically, you have to think about education as not as something that people complete and then go on to do their work lives, because people are going to have education for their entire working lives. You're going to have massive investments in things that unemployed people can do who can't retool. A 45-year-old unemployed steel worker is not going to become a software engineer, but they could build, windmills. They can build infrastructure, and so there has to be a lot of investment in that kind of thing. And then there has to be expanded social protection for the populations that are not going to be doing well all the time. So it's not rocket science, I think. But these are the basic things that are driving this. And unless they're in, people say, will Trump get elected? Won't he get elected? We could talk about that, but my point is, unless these things are addressed, there'll be another Trump and another Trump and another Trump. So if you want to know more about what I think about these different policies. The book on the left is about what I think needs to happen to political parties and the sort of details of how you do the reforms I just mentioned. The middle book is about the economic policies. And then my most recent book is about the underlying logic of what I've been talking about tonight. So I'll stop there, and everybody can tell me why I'm wrong. You sit here.
Well, can you hear me? Yeah, I think so. Well, thank you very much for the fantastic lecture. I learned a lot. Thank you very much for really the analysis of populism and how you get there and how to respond to that. I think what I would like to shift the discussion to would be a little bit really to the US context because of the upcoming elections in the US, and to see what sort of really is at stake in the United States when it comes to the sort of resilience of the democratic system and how to respond to the sort of angry populist politics, as you termed it here. And I think this discussion is also really important here for Germany and Europe, as you alluded to also, where, you know, we here in Germany, we of course follow closely what's going on in the United States, oftentimes with a mix of amazement, but then also a lot of anxiety, you know. And I think there's a lot of concerns about the sort of the threats to democracy in the United States. And I think this is also because we here in Germany, we feel if there's sort of an erosion of democracy in the United States, that will have a lot of implications for us as well, right? Because I kind of feel we as Europeans would feel quite isolated in the world, but at the same time we see all these sort of trends in the United States with the erosion of sort of democratic standards, etc. And we see that this is also, we might face similar challenges in Germany as well. As you just said, the AfD is strengthened, and a lot of sort of like populist tendencies also happening all over Europe, right? All over the world, but also in Europe. So let's pick up some of the topics that you have sort of mentioned here in your talk, and discuss them a little bit more in sort of detail. When it comes to, I made a few notes here. When it comes to, for example, the political system, one thing that I noticed here, and I would like to pick up here, is first of all, you mentioned that one of the real reasons for the populist tendencies in the United States is the disappearance of industrial jobs and the declining power of unions.
Yeah.
And I kind of have the impression, if you look at the Biden administration, this is one of the things that they understood, right? I mean, they analyzed pretty well what happened in 2016, what happened in the swing states, the loss of industrial jobs there. How do we get these voters back to the Democratic side, right? And then they came up with all these measures. Basically try to create new industrial jobs in order to reach these constituencies in the swing states. You had the Inflation Reduction Act, you had the Chips and Science Act. So basically in order to create a lot of new industrial jobs. So my question is here, really, is this strategy working? Do you feel like with these policies you can reach these voters that were lost, maybe to Trump, independence, etc.? Do these policies really reach sort of constituencies, and do they actually lead to more inclusive growth? As you also said, you know, you need to have more inclusive growth. Or are they rather seen as sort of like an elite policies again from the Democrats that don't really understand what these movements are about and what they lack? What is your assessment? Can Biden benefit from these policies in November?
Yeah. So I think, you know, the answer is yes to some extent, and it is certainly true that it's the first Democratic administration since the 60s who's trying to reassemble what we used to call the Great Society Coalition. That is, Lyndon Johnson's Great Society Coalition which was the sort of second variant of the New Deal, if you like. When we got Medicare, we got a lot of federal money in education, and he was Johnson was exactly trying to do that. And of course, he wasn't undone by that. He was undone by the Vietnam War. And, but after that, all the Democrats, starting with Carter, have basically, just as here, have moved to the center as communism collapsed, and it seemed like American-style capitalism was the only game in town, and so just like New Labour in Britain and the New Democrats in the U.S. and even here, it was after all a coalition of the SPD and the Greens in the early 21st century that put in the Hartz reforms, which are these pro-business. So, Biden is the first administration to say, no, we've got to really focus on these people. And so that he is trying to do the right things. I think there are several things obstructing him. First of all, it's extremely difficult for him to get the scale of it enacted through this Congress because of the political gridlock that I've talked about. And so he's reduced to trying to do a lot of it through executive orders, like the college loan stuff, which is, they're stonewalling. And a lot of these states that are hardest hit have Republican governors who resist all of these policies because they don't want to help Biden. So it's a very fractured political system. Nonetheless, he is, trying to do the things that need to be done. And I think it's, unfortunately, he's not a very good messenger, and he is too old, and all of these things. But, and it's taken so long to get so much of this agenda going that it's not clear how much, as you say, inclusive benefit, how much of this is really going to reach these populations who are most angry, alienated, and afraid. So, social scientists can't make pinpoint predictions. They can talk about basic patterns and trends. But, it is the kind of thing that needs to be done. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I mean, they are also very much long-term oriented, right? And many of these, you can see the results of these policies maybe in a few years, but maybe it would be better to really focus on the very short-term.
I think he would if he could. Yeah. If he could get it through Congress. It's not that he doesn't. As I said on the slide, none of this is rocket science. It's not, it's not complicated what needs to be done. What's complicated is the politics of actually getting it done. Yeah. Exactly. That's why I think you have to think about some political reforms too.
Yeah, I mean, political reforms, and I think this is not a completely new topic, right? I mean, and I noted this, it's not rocket science, but when it comes, I mean, you need a political will for that, right? I mean, for example, the election system, like we here in Europe, we look at the US and we see this very peculiar system where you have primaries, as you mentioned, and then you have the electoral college, etc. And as you already pointed out, the primaries, with a rather low voter turnout, sort of where you have extreme voters actually dominating the agenda. How do you get to the point to change that? I mean, you need political will for that. Yeah. And as long as one party benefits from the system, how do you get to that?
Or if both parties benefit, if the individuals. Yeah, I think that there are some grounds for hope, if not optimism, on that front, because for two reasons. One is the people in Congress, even though they know how to work the system to get reelected, they hate it. I mean, because another facet of weak parties is you have huge need for money. So they, when people talk about money in politics, they always focus on the supply side, the billionaires are giving the money and so forth. But why is there so much need for money? Why is there so much demand for money? Because retail politics is so much more expensive than wholesale politics. Every person in every seat needs money. So, and then the people funding them control them. So they hate it. A second, ground for some hope is the fastest, since I don't think you can get rid of primaries in America. They're just too baked in, even though they're not in the Constitution. But there is a move to take the drawing of districts, because the real problem isn't just the primaries. As I said, it's the interaction of the primaries and the safe seats. Mm-hmm. If you didn't have all these safe seats, it wouldn't matter that much, because the people getting elected would have to worry about the general election, and then they would have to move to the middle, no matter what the primary voters were doing. But since the only people who can knock them off are the primary voters, that's all they have to care about. So now in about 20, I think last time I looked, 22 or 23 of the states, more than a third of the states, there's been this big move to take away the redistricting from the state legislatures and create independent commissions to do it, which is the way, for instance, in Britain, every 10 years after the census, there's a 3-person commission that does the redistricting, and then Parliament can vote it up or down, but they can't fiddle with it. Mm-hmm. So, and that's the kind of world you need to get to. And so, there's a lot of wrangling about what these independent commissions should do. But I think if you said which reform that has a realistic chance, it's actually starting to happen in, almost half the states now, mm-hmm. that might make a dent in this. I think that is the current bandwagon to jump on, because it has some momentum, mm-hmm. and it's not, it's not as if the politicians like the system, because they're completely controlled by these extreme voters.
Yeah, I mean, if you have a safe seat, why would you be interested in changing it, right? And I mean, there's also a lot
because you might prefer to be accountable to the median American voter than to the Republican primary voter, because then you would be able to enact legislation, you would be able to work across the aisle with centrist Democrats, you would be able to do things, that at least when they first go into politics, politicians want to do. I mean, look, all these Republicans in the House now have spent 2 years doing is running investigations of Biden. They haven't been able to enact any policies either on their own because of their fracturing, or work with the Democrats, because anyone who does that will be killed. Yeah. So, it's after a while, what am I doing here? So if given the choice, would you rather be accountable to a median voter in the country or to these people on the parties? Most politicians would rather be accountable to the... I think that's why there's quite a lot of support for this.
Mm-hmm. Ranked choice system, is this a solution that you think would be feasible when you have that in Alaska?
It gets a lot of attention. People say it would produce more moderate candidates. The evidence on that is mixed. I'm not a big fan, because it doesn't fix the basic problem. It weakens parties further, because it keeps multiple candidates alive. I think parties should be like a team, where the people, the leadership and the backbenchers should all be on the same page, trying to do the same thing. Mm-hmm. And So a much healthier world is where the front benches pick the back benches, who pick the front benches, who pick the back benches over time, and forge what they, their research and constituency meetings and voter outreach tells them is likely to be a viable winning coalition. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So that would be a strong party system with strong parties. But I would like to...
And fewer of them.
And fewer of them.
Except not one, yeah.
I mean, depends on the context, right? In the US, maybe it would be more healthy to have more parties in...
Almost never. Because it produces fragmented governments.
Yeah. But, I mean, a strong party. Let's go back a little bit again to the sort of 2016 election, where many people would say that, Trump was actually, the whole movement is seen as sort of like a backlash against the traditional political parties, right? And you could see that on the Democratic side as well, right?
Yeah.
Bernie Sanders. And what makes you think, or what makes you optimistic that strong parties would, if you reform them, people would see them as legitimate? I mean, I always have the impression that there is 30–40% of the population, that don't believe in this sort of party system anymore, that want to have sort of like a strong leader who's above the sort of chaos in Congress and all the squabbling, and sort of like also all these constraints on the president by Congress, by the courts. There's the media constantly criticizing the president. I kind of feel there's a trend towards people that really want to have a stronger leader. How do you respond to that? I mean, how do you get...
Well, look, that's all true, but we've seen that play before. And it didn't end well in the 30s because these strong leaders actually don't have these solutions either. And so, what did they do? They took the world to war. They didn't fix their economies. So, look, I think most voters are, there's one of the buzzwords in political science is retrospective voters. Most voters don't read platforms. They don't really process or understand policies and platforms. They're mostly reactive. If a government delivers for them, they re-elect the government. Mm-hmm. And if the government fails to deliver, they look for somebody else. And so governments have to deliver. And a lot of these trends began in the 1980s when it seemed like the standard Keynesian policies hadn't vanquished the stagflation of the 70s. It had all the usual Keynesian policies were done, and it didn't work. They had high unemployment and high inflation, and nothing made a dent on it until it changes in the economy and finally made it go away. But that was when the social democratic consensus started taking big hits. That's when Mitterrand did his about face. That's when you saw, the rise of Reagan and Thatcher, and it was because that whole set of policies was thought no longer to be delivering. And so then people blamed the political system and started reforming, said, we've got to fix the political system. We've got to get more democracy. We've got to end the system. And so we need, primaries to be more important. And so we need direct election of leaders without realizing that the things they were doing were actually making it even harder for the politicians to govern. Yeah. And so it's a very bad equilibrium now, that what you're describing, but we have to think about changes at the margin that will nudge us out of it. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I mean, for example, if you look again at the current situation, the economic numbers seem to be pretty well, right? The economy seems to be going in the right direction, at least to the statistics.
The U.S. economy.
The U.S. economy. But then, like, the polls don't show that. I mean, Biden doesn't seem to benefit from that. So that makes you wonder to what extent voters are still up for these sort of rational factors. I mean, the slogan, "It's the economy, stupid," does that still count today? Or is it more sort of narrow policies that people really focus on?
I think it is the economy, but these policies haven't reached those voters yet. I mean, I think so it's not really inclusive growth yet. Yep. You know, and he's in a race against, he's also not he really is too old, and he's not a good messenger for what he's trying to do and so forth. So he's got this other baggage. But I do think, if you look at these declining coal and steel mills in Pennsylvania, they look around them and you tell them these economic numbers and they say, I don't see it. Nothing around here has changed, And I think they could still do more targeted things. And, for example, this might be a little bit too much in the weeds here, but there's something in this one policy in the US called the Earned Income Tax Credit, which is actually a subsidy to business in the sense that it's government subsidizing wages. So obviously it's a subsidy to business, but they pay it to the worker. So it's not like, Trump in 2017 gave big tax breaks to business saying they'll invest and create jobs, but of course they didn't. They used it to do stock buybacks. This, with the Earned Income Tax Credit, you actually have to hire the worker to get the subsidy. Otherwise, you don't get it because it's paid to the worker, right? And at the door, we argued, and I actually pushed this on one of the Biden policy committees. They haven't done it, but I think it's the kind of thing that would work better in the short run. You're talking about. You can target these EIC, so the states have them too. So, the state of Pennsylvania could be offering EITC benefits to companies that come into those communities and build wind farms or whatever it is. But they have to actually create the jobs to get the subsidy. And the very nice thing about it is, when people talk about the minimum wage, the economists will say, oh, race to the bottom. If Pennsylvania puts up its minimum wage, the capital will just go to, South Carolina. But if Pennsylvania puts in an earned income tax credit, it creates a race to the top because the capital will come to Pennsylvania in search of these credits. So there are things like that actually can be done that would bring short-run benefits, and also while you're waiting for the longer-term things to kick in. And I think more of that kind of thing. But, certainly electing Donald Trump is not, it's not going to deliver anything for these people. So in that sense, it is the economy stupid. You have to focus on what it is that is driving their insecurity.
Well, one thing I think that those people in favor of Trump would say, like, we have to do something about the border and immigration system. And this is one topic where, do you see that there will be a lot of movement on that before the elections? Or, the Biden administration knows that they're vulnerable on that topic, right?
It's such a sideshow, really, because, this is such an interesting puzzle, because you look at all of these countries, all these older democracies, any economist would say, any demographer would say, they all need immigration because they all are facing the same demographic transition. That is, they've got a shrinking working age population, and they're supporting a growing retired population, and the economics doesn't compute. And yet, hostility to immigration is such an easy card to play in politics because, you can say it's these Mexicans who are coming in and taking your jobs, or in Britain, it's the Polish plumbers that are taking your jobs. Well, the Mexicans and Polish plumbers aren't taking their jobs. And so you can seal off the border. It's not going to address. Their jobs have been increasing. Their jobs now are going to robots. They're going, it's ridiculous. And anyway, if you look at the jobs the immigrants that they demonize do, American workers and British workers won't do those jobs. They are picking oranges in New Mexico, in Texas, or in Southern California. And they are cleaning people's houses and doing their gardening, and unemployed Americans don't want to do that. And they won't do it. And so it's a very good example, I think, that in all of the country that has got the worst demographic transition problem is Japan. And the hostility to immigration is white hot in Japan. No politician can, but no Korean worker coming into Japan is going to take Japanese jobs, But there it is. It's a very easy card to play, and and now the Biden people are running scared of it, and they got behind this bill, and maybe the Republicans will overreach, and maybe they won't. Who knows? But Trump could build his wall. It's not going to solve these people's problem at all, and he doesn't have anything to solve their problem. And so, you have to come back, I think, over and over again to the basic things that are driving their economic insecurity and their fear and their anxiety. And, unless those things are addressed, you're going to constantly have these essentially, spurious debates about things that are irrelevant, and but they can be politically explosive. And immigration's Exhibit A.
I mean, one of the things that contributes to that is, of course, social media. To what extent do you feel that contributes to the growth of populism overall? And
yeah, I think it's social media is just a kind of end point. 40 years ago, everybody watched the same news. And then we got cable, and then we got satellite, and now we've got social media. And so you have more and more people talking to people just like themselves, and that produces echo chambers of self-reinforcing messages. Most 25 to 40-year-olds don't even get their news from the news. They get it all from social media.
Yeah.
And they only will go to social media of like-minded people. And so that's, very bad for trying to break through the self-reinforcing. Yeah, it's a huge problem. I don't have any particular insight into it.
I mean, it's just an overall trend, right? You have these echo chambers that you mentioned, but then there's also the fact that Democrats and Republican voters don't really live in the same neighborhoods anymore. There's not a lot of space for interactions.
Yeah, so all of those things.
Do you feel that there are ways to improve
I think,
that again?
if you start redistricting to have, you have here in Germany, you have 299 single-member districts, I think. That's right, right? And they are pretty big, diverse districts, so much bigger than the British districts, for example. And in America, the problem is that the demographic sorting has made so many safe seats, but you can, instead of having urban districts and suburban districts, you draw the districts across the urban-suburban line. Ideally, every district in America should have some urban voters, some suburban voters, some rural voters in it. And every district in Britain should have a slice of London in it, because that's where all the wealth is. And so you want a world in which the politicians running in these districts want to find a way to reach these different groups, right? And so that's why I said earlier, I think the move towards independent commissions drawing districts is a very healthy move. And I think, you know, the next step is to get them to these commissions to see that the main thing they should be trying to create is competitive districts that have diversity, that doesn't reinforce where you have, you know, just, you know, blue cities and red states, and so you have, you know, conservative Republicans in the outside of the cities, and you have liberal Democrats in the cities. Is hopeless.
Because it's such a urban, rural.
So I think this is a good development, and I think it needs attention and support, and
Yeah, I mean, going back again to the sort of populism and anti-establishment politicians, do you see, I mean, if you look back in American history, this is not a completely new trend, right? Do you feel like that every system has to endure this at some time? Or do you feel now, after 2016, the genie has been taken out of the bottle and now you can't get him in again, or her, or whatever it is?
I don't know. I think, I mean, throughout, if you talk over the long haul of American history, there have been periods of strengthening parties and periods of weakening parties. I mean, the first big, interesting, from today's perspective, until about the first end of the first third, until I think about 1828, in the US, actually the congressional parties used to pick the presidential candidate. So it was much more like a parliamentary system. They didn't have, nobody had heard of primaries or anything. And so the party members in Congress picked the presidential candidate. And it was Andrew Jackson, who was the first populist, didn't like that system because he didn't get picked. And he mounted the first populist attack on it, and that's when they basically went to conventions. But there have been eras after the Jim Crow era where the parties became somewhat stronger, and certainly Lyndon Johnson strengthened the parties in the Senate a great deal before he became president. So it's not impossible. It's difficult, but it's not impossible.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much. I would end it here. There's still some books to sign, and I think there will be also some refreshments. And yeah, I leave it to Bartley.
Thank you very much. Thanks. Just a couple of remarks before we go. Do you want to tell people, you were very good at saying where you can be found, and he does have lectures online. The Devane lectures are online, right?
Yeah.
And you just go to your website?
Yeah, well, they're on YouTube.
They're on YouTube.
Yeah.
There you go.
Yeah.
And are you on Twitter or anywhere people want to follow you?
Yep.
At Dominik? You?
Yeah, yeah.
Mm-hmm. At Dominik Tolksdorf? Okay, Google it.
Yeah.
So I also do want to thank the team at amerikahaus, Dr. Zwingenberger and Dominik Rabe, and of course the fantastic tech team in the back and everybody who makes us all feel so welcome here. Thank you. Two more quick thank yous tonight on that note. The Melior Foundation in Munich and to the Yale Alumni Association in New Haven for financial support tonight. And finally, you. I want to thank you all for coming, for joining the conversation, for those of you watching online, and for those of you who have donated to make our events possible. So thank you. And Professor Shapiro's new book talks about the importance of what he calls strategically hopeful leaders, which we sort of talked about what that looks like, right? But it's up to us to vote those people into office. So thank you for staying here and being engaged and thinking about that. If you're not already a member of our community, you can go to dialoguesondemocracy.com, put your email address in, and you'll just get information about what our programs are. And tonight, Professor Shapiro has offered to stay and sign his new book, As Long as They Last. They come out in April, and I've been able to get a few copies from the publisher directly, and we're happy to pass on our price to you. So if you want the book, it is available out front until they're gone. And there is a bar out there so we can continue the conversation. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you very much for coming. And we'll see you next time. Stay engaged.